Hey everyone, Keto Comic here. White Collar Wednesday, Madoff Part 2. I do apologize for the different setup here. My computer that I normally use, always very reliable, kind of went bonkers on me, so I'm in the process of defragmenting it and cleaning it, so I had to use backup computer, which is much smaller to finish this out, so I do apologize for that. Anyway, let's get into this, shall we? When we first left our old buddy Bernie, who's pictured right here, we left him about 1991, just before his business went from legitimate to illegitimate. Now, Bernie, as I said, was what we call a affinity investor. Now, an affinity investor is simply someone that preaches to those of their own kind. For him, that was very wealthy people and the Jewish American community. So that's who he pitched his services to, and also had a referral system, if you'll recall, to bring people in. He was also a three-time chairman of the NASDAQ, highly respected, did a lot of lobbying. His niece Shanna, who worked as his public relations person, did a lot of lobbying with the Senate. She was also active with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as was he. His niece also married Eric Swanson, who was a lead investigator for the SEC. So the Madoff family was heavily, and the Madoff firm was heavily entrenched along with regulators, had a good reputation. In fact, regulators called upon them to help them sort out other scandals. So this is why there are many reasons why this scandal took so long to unravel, but that's a major part, is the investors and the actual regulators that were over this industry trusted Bernie so highly. As we also said earlier, he loved to keep his operations separate from each other. He expanded from 2 floors to 3 floors in the Lipstick Building and kept everything that he needed on the 18th and 19th floor, while his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, ran investments on the 17th floor. But starting in 1991, Mark and Andrew were sort of branching out on their own, and their father allowed them to keep working in his building and within his business, but they kind of branched out, started doing their own investing for their own clients, so their attention was more and more turned away from what was going on with Bernard L. Madoff Investments, LLC. And so all of that would fall squarely on Bernie's shoulders, Peter, his brother, who ran the day-to-day operations, and to a lesser extent his niece, as well as a myriad of other officers and things like that. But as we had discussed before, he had developed a reputation for guaranteeing pretty high returns of around 10%. He also had a reputation of actually delivering returns around 7%, but now was starting to promise more exuberant returns of over 10%. He started a hedge fund, and if you don't know what a hedge fund is, this is in the early 90s, it's a fund that basically has groups investments from a whole bunch of different investors on both risky and good stocks, and kind of hedges everyone's bets to kind of prevent them from losing money. This was done by means of what we call and put invested, or options investing. Basically, on an option, you make a bid that an option will not go above or below a certain price, and you basically invest in the theory that that stock is not going to exceed those limits on the high end or the low end, and it protects your investment unless it does go above or below that. So it's a very risky form of trading. It's way too much for me to explain here, but if you go to just do a simple Google search on options investing and you'll see what it is. And hedge funds were created to help people that wanted to engage in riskier options investing to maintain as much of their money as they can without having a huge loss. So that's pretty much what he did. He had his own hedge fund that was consistently returning 12% returns on all investments. Now, he did this for many years, made a lot of people very wealthy. They always got their statements, but the thing of it is, Madoff was not investing a single dime of his investors' money. He was just putting it into a big account and paying the early investors with the late investors' money if he had to. Moreover, his strategy was to tell someone like me when their 2 years or 1 year was up and they wanted their money, saying, why don't you just leave it and let it grow more? You'll make more money. And so greed is just kind of, I guess, in everyone. Everybody wants to make the most money possible. So people would leave their money in so he never had to pay them. So he had all this new money coming in because once people saw that his people, even in slight downturns or bad years, were still making around 12%, of course he was getting all kinds of investment. But not everybody bought it. And that's very important. Let's get into that. His hedge fund was using what we call feeder funds. Now, feeder funds, instead of just taking the money and straight up investing it himself, he was supposedly investing it through other funds. And he had a couple of them, most of them based in Connecticut. Greenwich Foundation Fund was one of them, one of the major ones. So he would get with a fund like that and basically tell them he was going to channel all his investments through them, which would allow them to make money. So on the flip side, they would recommend his fund to their clients. So it was just kind of a feeder finder kind of network, if that makes sense. So instead of direct investing, he was feeder investing. So he was investing through these other funds, which allowed him to play off the people within his organization, like his sons, that were doing legitimate business as to why no investments were being made. Well, we're making them through these other funds, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Kind of like laundering investments, but less creepy than that, if that makes sense. So that's what he was doing. But there were a lot of people that weren't exactly buying it. One of them, in late 1998, actually started investigating him on their own. He was a investment trader from Boston named Harry Markopoulos, who worked for actually a competitor of Madoff's, who wanted to see if there was a way to match Madoff's success. So they went through the SEC and some other legal entities and were able to get basically copies, generic copies of some of the statements Madoff had been sending to investors, or some of their and some of their financial statements. Now, Madoff spent hours, and his people spent hours, literally forging documents. They would take the actual returns from what little money was actually invested through the feeder funds, and they would alter those to match 12%, or they would just completely make up investments, make up returns, and just completely fabricate statements and send them out to all their clients. So your client, if you were a client of Madoff, you were getting these statements that showed these fabulous returns, and you were all happy. There was no need to question anything. Well, Markopoulos was able to get a hold of publicly available documents, and he started doing a reverse breakdown. Kind of a financial autopsy, if that makes any sense. He would go in reverse. He would basically spend hours doing all kinds of complicated mathematical formulas to see if he could mimic what Madoff was doing, because his company wanted to be able to do that too. So they tasked him with figuring out how Madoff was doing it. Well, after hours and hours and hours of trying to replicate Madoff's results, he realized they were impossible to do legitimately. So he came to the realization that either, number one, Madoff was doing all this with insider trading information, which would not have been out of the bounds of possibilities, being that he was so well connected with the SEC and the NASDAQ that he might have insider information, which is where you know something about a company before it happens, and use that to trade to your advantage, which is highly illegal. So Markopoulos said either, number one, he's doing insider trading, or number two, this is an absolute scam and probably a Ponzi scheme. He did not want to believe it was the second option of a Ponzi scheme, so he started doing some other digging to see what insider information Madoff could possibly be getting. And he had so many governmental and Wall Street connections that it could have very easily been coming from anywhere. So based on some of the returns, because Madoff's funds relied very heavily on commodities, which are sugar, coffee, those kind of oil, those kind of things that people use in their everyday lives that are traded on the stock market, usually out of speculation, like, what's a barrel of oil really worth? Well, it's only worth what people are willing to pay for it, so people make a living off of basically estimating what a person will pay for oil or gas. So that's how commodities prices are set. They make a guess about what people are willing to pay for it. So there's a lot of speculation there. Commodities trading is some of the riskiest, and when you get into commodities options, which is what Madoff had a lot of his money in, or at least he said he did, it takes a mathematical and Wall Street genius to unravel it. Another reason that he didn't get caught for so long. So he actually, Markopoulos actually went to some friends of his on the Chicago Commodities Exchange, which is one of the largest commodities exchanges in the world, and kind of ran his numbers past them, and they basically told him, look, if this is legit, if this was actually legit, Madoff would literally have to buy and sell more commodities than we have listed on the entire exchange to make this work. So he knew right away there was no way, even with insider information, there was no way these returns could be occurring. So this had to be some sort of scam. So Markopoulos went to the SEC, turned in all of his documentation, and reported Madoff in 2000, 2001, 3 times in 2005, and finally again in 2008, about 3 months before the scandal actually fell apart and broke. 5 to 6 times Markopoulos warned the SEC that something was fishy with Bernie Madoff, and they ignored him. And Markopoulos was not the only one. There were other people with other firms, like legitimate people from like Merrill Lynch, J.P. Chase Morgan, who absolutely realized that something was fishy with Madoff. No one gets those kind of returns consistently, number one, because in all the history from 1991 through 2008, when it fell apart, Madoff never showed a loss. Now, that's a long time. He only showed consistent growth. From his inception in the 1960s through 1990-91, he did show losses, ups and downs, just like most legitimate houses did. But Madoff, from 1991 through the end of the scandal, never once showed a dip. So that's how you had more relevant and more legitimate Wall Street investors saying, this is bullshit. There's something going on. So you had a lot of people starting to talk, and that therefore you had investments starting to slow down just a little bit. And then 2006, the subprime mortgage, the bottom fell out of the subprime mortgage mess, and it trickled on down to the economy, and we had a legitimate recession, also known as the Great Recession, which almost brought our economy to a halt. And when that happened, investing dried up. People had huge drops in their investment portfolios. People lost half their retirements. My own parents lost about a quarter of their retirement right before they were going to retire. So you had a lot of panic, and therefore people just weren't investing. People started wanting their principal back. Well, at one point in October of 2008, you had people going to Bernie Madoff asking for their entire investment back to the tune of about $7 billion. Now, bear in mind, Madoff should have had $65 billion under management, so returning that $7 billion shouldn't have been any sweat off his balls, if you know what I mean. But he told them, I can't do it. I only have $200 to $300 million cash flow available. Well, that set off alarms. People started complaining to the SEC, complaining to every other regulatory body, and an investigation started. Meanwhile, you had his sons, Mark and Andrew, that were getting highly suspicious of what was going on. And they went and confronted their father, who basically told them, you do what you do, I'll do what I do, don't worry about it. Well, they realized at that point something was going on. So that because they started digging into some records, they realized a lot of things had been shredded and done away with. So Mark and Andrew got together, went to the SEC with the documentation that they could find in their father's office, and turned their father in December 2008. And Bernie was indeed arrested in mid-December 2008 on fraud charges. And improprieties in investing. During the course of the investigation, it all started to come out. Bernie was actually released on a $10 million bond that same month and went home under house arrest at his New York penthouse. His brother Peter was also released on bond, and for a long time, and for a few months they were out until they actually realized he was a flight risk because of his money and the availability of houses all over the world, and he knew people all over the world. They eventually revoked that and put him back in jail in around February of 2009. But for the 2 months he was out, he lived pretty well like he had before, but it all started to come out what happened. Basically, not a dime of this money had been invested except for just a tiny little bit to keep his feeder funds from getting suspicious. The rest of it just sat in a savings account or a bank account drawing money, or was immediately funneled out and put into purchases for the Madoff family, paying employees, houses, cars, you name it, and they lived off of these investors' money, just taking out enough to pay off investors that wanted their money out until the whole lot of them came and it kind of collapsed the system. Remember, all Ponzi schemes will be successful until the amount of money going out exceeds the amount of money coming in, and then they're inevitably going to collapse. And that's what happened here. More people started wanting their investment rather than rolling it over because of the financial crisis. Everybody's confidence in Wall Street was low. So everybody wanted their money. They wanted their cash to sit on until the crisis passed. And that's what happened to Madoff. So he never really legitimately invested any of this in options or commodities or anything. And he was literally just faking the whole thing. Meanwhile, as the investigation goes up, it really starts to devolve into who was actually at fault. There was a lot of speculation that his two sons, Mark and Andrew, were actually connected, although they were never charged. But there was a lot of speculation that they knew about it, even though their testimony was that they had their own business going, didn't really pay attention to what was happening with their father until it all started to unravel, and that they took the initiative to turn their father in. And once they turned their father in, they had absolutely no contact with their parents. Bernie and Ruth Madoff kind of became secluded, especially when it came out that they had withdrawn well over $40 million over the 6 years just prior to the collapse, and they had shelled it away in a overseas account. So that didn't help them when that came out. Also, the fact that their children and grandchildren no longer wanted anything to do with them kind of put them at the lowest point in their lives. And on Christmas Eve 2008, they attempted suicide by taking sleeping pills. But it was a failed attempt. Madoff eventually did go to trial, and in 2009 was sentenced to 150 years, which at his age is 2 more lifetimes, and is now serving his sentence in North Carolina in federal prison, where actually in recent interviews with Barbara Walters and other journalists, he said he's relieved that the whole scandal is over. He feels better in prison. He feels safe. And he has maintained to this day he doesn't know why he did it. He said he could have lived comfortably on what he had made as a legitimate investor for the rest of his life. So he doesn't know why he did it, but he did allude to the fact that it was the investor's fault for not checking him out. He was kind of smug about it. It's their fault. They should have checked it out better. Investment is risky. They should have known that. He and Ruth have since divorced. She was, even though all of his assets were frozen and things started to be auctioned off right down to Ruth's jewelry to pay back some of the people that he scammed, because, of course, Bernie Madoff Investments went into bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy trustee, Mr. Picard, started selling off assets to try to help people recover some of what they lost. Ruth was actually allowed to keep $2.5 million and now lives in a $3,000 a month apartment in Greenwich, Connecticut. A lot of people are upset about that. I understand that. I think I'm not one of the victims, so it's easy for me to say that just she is worth a fraction of what she used to be worth. She has no contact with her kids or her grandkids, really, so she's living a miserable life. Let her have her one-bedroom apartment and a little bit of security. But I also wasn't one of the victims, so I understand why people get angry about that. But to still be a millionaire after you do this, yeah, I understand why people are upset. But she was allowed to keep $2.5 million and one car to live out the rest of her life on, because she's in her 70s, far too old to work or gain any more money. There was also sat in for their sons, Mark, who was overcome with guilt over the whole scam, why he didn't discover it, why he didn't blow the whistle a lot sooner, and also just over the split and rift it had caused in the family, hung himself in December of 2010, exactly 2 years after he turned his father in. Andrew died in 2014 of cancer. So you can say that the Madoff family has been paid back in spades. Brother Peter Madoff was sentenced in 2012 to 10 years and fines of over $100 million. Bernie Madoff settled the lawsuit filed against him by the SEC and the bankruptcy court by basically turning over ownership of everything he owned. Some of those scammed have been paid back. In fact, as late as 2017, another $777 million was collected through all the auctions and seized products to pay over 24,000 investors back. And like most bankruptcy, they looked at it at how much a person had profited or lost on the scam. Those that were called net winners, which were those that, based on the statements that Madoff had sent them, those falsified statements, had withdrew over the years more money than they actually invested, they were told they would not receive any restitution. In fact, they may be part of a clawback, which means to pay off the people that lost money, to make it equal, they may actually take money from those that were net winners, that is, people that over the years withdrew way more than they invested, may actually get a clawback, and that will go back into the pot to help pay back those that were considered net losers, or those that didn't withdraw anything or withdrew under what they had invested or just what they invested were considered net losers, and those are the ones that still remain to be paid. They've all received approximately 40 to 60% of their investment back so far. That will probably be the extent of it, but you have to think about a lot of these people lost their life savings. And a lot of changes came out. In fact, my mother-in-law got a lot of paperwork from her retirement account. She goes, "Why do I have to sort through all this paperwork? Don't I have people to do this?" And I said, "You know why you have to sort through all that paperwork? Because of Bernard Madoff. The regulations changed, whereas you receive multiple notices, not just from your broker, but from, or whoever handles your investments, but from each individual fund that you may be invested in is now required to send you a statement because of Bernard Madoff. Bernard Madoff ran on the premise that he was a custodial investment advisor, meaning he took your money, he invested it, he sent you all documentation. That's no longer considered a good practice because you need to be in contact with everyone handling your money. Even though you may have your account with Merrill Lynch, they may be investing in a Fidelity mutual fund, so both Merrill Lynch and Fidelity will now send you statements, thanks to Bernard Madoff. Also, Securities and Exchange Commission has undergone some transformation. One reason that they didn't really dig into the whistleblowers like Macropolis that sent them all kinds of indications that Madoff was doing fishy things is because they were mostly made up of lawyers and law enforcement. They had no idea how to really break down a statement and understand what was going on. They didn't really have any brokers or investment advisors or mathematicians on their team. That has now changed. They are now equally distributed between legal minds, law enforcement, and financial minds, which I don't understand a financial regulatory agency not having financial people on their team, but they didn't, and that's one reason that Madoff was allowed to get away with this for so long, because they could look at the broad strokes and see minor things that could be explained away, but they couldn't really dig into it like Macropolis did in digging up the whole thing. So that has changed. So bottom line is, Madoff sits in prison in North Carolina. He will for the rest of his life. His wife is living a hand-to-mouth let's not say hand to mouth, because she still has $2.5 million in the bank, even though she's living in a very expensive state of Connecticut. She's still doing quite well. His daughter-in-laws are living off of the life insurance and things left by their husbands, and the rest of the Madoff family died. So I can see how the Madoff family, perhaps karma-wise, has been punished for this, but I don't think their victims will ever feel that they've received good restitution. What do you guys think of this? Do you think it was the government's fault? Do you think it was Madoff's fault? What do you think? I'd love to know your opinions down below. And I'll be back soon with another true crime video. With Sunday Bloody Sunday coming up. I'll be back next week with another white collar crime. Thank you so much, y'all. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Ketosis, y'all. Keto Comic. Out.